It was supposed to be a peaceful, relaxing evening for Sandra Bullock. The bustling world of Hollywood had taken a back seat for once, as the beloved actress enjoyed a quiet dinner at one of the city's most prestigious restaurants. She sat alone, savoring her meal, unaware that an encounter with a rude waiter would soon make her the center of a public spectacle. The situation started innocuously enough, a snide comment here, a dismissive attitude there. But as the waiter's behavior escalated, Sandra found herself caught in a moment of unwanted attention. His insults, laced with condescension, began to humiliate her in front of the other diners. Just when it seemed like the night could not get any worse, a familiar face entered the scene: Keanu Reeves. Calm, composed, and effortlessly cool, Keanu wasn't about to let this injustice slide. What happened next took everyone by surprise and would change Sandra's night in an instant. The restaurant was one of those rare gems in the city that catered to an exclusive clientele. To get a reservation here, one had to either be well-connected or have an undeniable reputation. The rich, inviting scent of freshly cut flowers mingled with the subtle hints of expensive perfume that lingered in the air. It was a place where the rich and famous came to indulge in fine dining, away from the prying eyes of paparazzi and fans. The atmosphere was elegant, almost dreamlike, with soft lighting casting a warm golden hue across the room. Large chandeliers hung above, their crystal pendants glimmering with each flicker of the candlelight, giving the space an almost ethereal glow. Sandra Bullock, the actress who had charmed millions with her talent and wit, sat at a corner table, her back to the wall. For the first time in what felt like ages, she was alone. She had spent the last few months juggling the relentless demands of the Hollywood machine: endless promotions, interviews, red carpets, and, of course, filming. Her latest projects. It was a whirlwind of excitement and energy, but it had left her craving peace and solitude. Tonight was her night to recharge, to get away from the spotlight and enjoy a simple meal without the constant buzz of cameras or fans following her every move. It was rare for Sandra to have a quiet evening like this, and she was savoring it. As she looked over the menu, the soft hum of the restaurant filled her ears, the murmur of other diners speaking in low tones, the clinking of fine china, and the occasional tinkling of glasses. Soft jazz played in the background, adding a layer of sophistication to the ambiance. She took a sip of her wine, letting the smooth, rich flavor wash over her. The wine was a deep red, the kind that could only be found in a place like this. Exquisite, but not overpowering. She glanced around the room, noting the elegant diners around her. The well-dressed couples and individuals chatting and laughing softly, the waitstaff moving gracefully between tables, ensuring everything was in perfect order. It was the kind of place where one could escape, blend in, and enjoy a night of indulgence, without a care in the world. As Sandra settled into the comfort of the restaurant's calming environment, she couldn't help but smile. It was rare for her to sit down for a meal without a constant stream of distractions. In the last few months, her life had been a whirlwind, and a simple dinner, free of the hustle of her usual schedule, felt like a gift. She took another sip of her wine, feeling the cool glass against her fingers. The soft melodies of the jazz band played in the background, allowing her to unwind and leave the stress of her daily life behind. What Sandra didn't know, however, was that her peaceful evening was about to take a turn. A seemingly small, innocuous interaction with a waiter would slowly unravel the calm facade of the night, dragging her into an uncomfortable situation that would test her patience and grace. It all started when a waiter approached her table. He was young, maybe in his mid-20s, wearing the standard black and white uniform of the restaurant staff, his face a mix of professionalism and a subtle air of arrogance. At first, Sandra didn't think much of it. Waiters were, after all, a part of the dining experience, and she had grown accustomed to interacting with them during her meals. "Good evening, Ms. Bullock," he said with a polite nod, his voice smooth and practiced. "What can I get you this evening?" Sandra smiled, nodding in return. "Thank you. I'll have the house special, please, and a glass of your finest red wine." The waiter nodded again, jotting down her order. His demeanor remained polite, but something about the way he carried himself rubbed Sandra the wrong way. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she didn't think too much of it. Maybe he was simply nervous. After all, it wasn't every day that a famous actress dined in one of the most exclusive restaurants in town. But as the night wore on, Sandra began to notice the waiter's attitude shifting. He was still polite, but his tone had become slightly condescending, as if he was trying to impress her, or worse, talk down to her. At first she tried to ignore it, chalking it up to her own tiredness, but as time passed, his behavior became harder to overlook. The first remark came when he returned, with her wine, setting it down on the table with a flourish. "A fine choice, Miss Bullock," he said, almost too smugly. "I imagine you're used to drinking only the best, yes?" Sandra's smile faltered for a moment, but she brushed it off. "I'm just enjoying a nice meal," she said, trying to keep the conversation light, but the waiter wasn't finished. As he set down her main course, he added with a slight sneer, "You know, Ms. Bullock, I've always admired your work, but I have to say, some of your recent films, not quite up to the standards of your earlier work." Sandra's eyes widened in surprise. Was this really happening? She had faced critics and reviews throughout her career, but this was different. This wasn't a polite comment or even a suggestion. It was an outright insult, and it was coming from a waiter, of all people. The situation was starting to feel awkward, but Sandra kept her composure. "Everyone has their opinions," she said, her voice calm but with a hint of tension. "I'm just here to enjoy a meal, not discuss my career." The waiter seemed to take it as an opportunity to press further. Of course," he said with a forced smile. "But you know, I always feel that some actors get too caught up in their popularity and forget what truly makes a movie great. Not that you would know anything about that, of course." Sandra's patience, which had been wearing thin for some time, snapped. She wasn't about to let this young, arrogant waiter continue to undermine her. The words that came next were sharp, her voice firm and controlled. "I don't think you have any right to talk to me like that," she said, her eyes narrowing. "You're here to serve me, not judge my career." For a moment, the waiter looked taken aback. His cocky demeanor faltered, and he stood there, unsure of how to respond. It was clear that Sandra wasn't the type to back down. The tension between them was thick, and the other diners were starting to notice the exchange. Before things could escalate any further, a familiar figure stepped into the scene, Keanu Reeves. The calm, composed actor, who had been dining nearby, noticed the interaction and immediately recognized the discomfort on Sandra's face. Without missing a beat, he stood up and made his way over to the table. Keanu had always been known for his kindness and his ability to stay composed in the most stressful situations. As he approached the waiter, the room seemed to hold its breath. Everyone knew something important was about to happen, and no one was sure how it would unfold. "Is there a problem here?" Keanu asked, his voice steady and polite, but carrying an undeniable authority. The waiter, now visibly flustered, stammered and tried to apologize, but the damage had already been done. Keanu, with his quiet strength, turned to Sandra and offered a reassuring smile. "I think you've had enough of this nonsense," he said, turning back to the waiter. "Maybe you should reconsider your approach to customer service." The waiter, now completely uncomfortable, muttered another apology before walking away, leaving the tension in the air. Sandra, feeling the weight of the moment lift, let out a quiet sigh of relief. Keanu's intervention had turned a potentially disastrous situation into something manageable, and he had done so without raising his voice or making a scene. As the night went on, Sandra could finally relax. The rude waiter was gone, and with Keanu's calming presence by her side, she could enjoy the rest of her meal in peace. This wasn't just a dinner. It was a reminder that sometimes a simple act of kindness and courage can make all the difference in the world. The waiter, a young man in his mid-20s, approached Sandra's table with a confident air, his uniform perfectly pressed and his posture straight. At first, his polite demeanor put her at ease. Sandra had spent her life in the public eye, interacting with a wide range of personalities, and she had become accustomed to handling various situations with grace. She smiled and nodded as he introduced himself and took her order, suggesting a few of the restaurant's specialties. It seemed like just another routine exchange between diner and server. However, as the conversation progressed, Sandra began to notice a subtle shift in the waiter's tone. His compliments, while seemingly innocent at first, started to feel disingenuous, almost rehearsed. He mentioned the wine she was considering ordering, saying, "A great choice for someone of your stature." His words, though polite, carried a slight undertone of condescension, as though he were subtly commenting on her celebrity status rather than her taste. Sandra's smile wavered slightly, but she didn't let it show. She had dealt with much worse in her career, and a rude waiter, while annoying, wasn't going to ruin her evening. She responded politely, "Thank you. I've heard great things about it," hoping to steer the conversation back to more neutral ground. But the waiter didn't take the hint. Instead, he continued, "Of course, you probably don't have much time to appreciate the finer details of the menu, what with your busy schedule and all." There it was again, the undertone, this time tinged with judgment. Sandra's instincts told her that he was making an assumption about her, something she often dealt with, but she had hoped it wouldn't follow her into a nice, quiet dinner. Sandra's expression remained composed as she nodded, responding with a polite, "I do enjoy good food when I can find the time." But now the conversation was veering into uncomfortable territory. The waiter wasn't just offering recommendations anymore. He was making comments about her life, about her career. It wasn't the first time someone had made assumptions about her personal life or her time, but there was something about this moment that felt different. "Yes, I imagine it's hard to really enjoy a meal when you're always in the spotlight," the waiter said, his voice almost dripping with sarcasm. "It must be nice to just sit down and forget about all the cameras for a while." Sandra's smile tightened, but she didn't respond. She could feel the heat creeping up her neck, a sign that her patience was beginning to wear thin. She knew she couldn't let this escalate into a confrontation. Not here. Not now. But the waiter seemed determined to keep pushing. As he placed the bread basket on the table and refilled her water glass, he added, "It's funny, isn't it? How people like you get to experience things in life that the rest of us can only dream of. Like dining at places like this." Sandra felt a familiar knot of frustration in her stomach. She'd spent years honing the art of remaining composed under pressure, especially in the face of public scrutiny. But this man, who she didn't even know, was making her feel as though her worth was being reduced to nothing more than her status. The casual way he spoke about her, like she was some object of fascination or entitlement, was starting to irk her in ways she couldn't easily brush off. "Actually, it's not as glamorous as people think," Sandra said, her voice cool and even. She didn't want to make a scene, but she couldn't just let the waiter continue with his dismissive attitude. "I do enjoy moments like this, away from the cameras, just like anyone else." The waiter, however, seemed to dismiss her response, entirely continuing his line of questioning with a smirk. "I bet," he said. "I bet you've seen it all. First-class everything, private jets, luxury cars." His tone was becoming more pronounced now, more mocking, as if he were addressing someone beneath him, not a paying customer at a fine restaurant. Sandra's patience was now dangerously close to its limit. It wasn't just that this waiter was being rude, it was the fact that he was treating her as if she were some kind of stereotype, a caricature of what people thought a celebrity's life was like. This wasn't just a casual conversation anymore. It felt personal. She wasn't some type to be placed in a box, and the insinuation that she had no real appreciation for the simplicity of life because of her career was starting to irritate her deeply. She tried to maintain her composure, hoping it was just a misstep. "I think we're all entitled to a little bit of peace and quiet," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was trying to remain calm, trying to keep things civil, but she could feel her emotions rising. But the waiter was undeterred. As he leaned closer to the table, his next words were more cutting than ever. "Well, let's be honest," he said, his voice now unmistakably sarcastic. "You probably don't even know what it's like to struggle for anything. Must be nice to always have everything handed to you on a silver platter, right?" Sandra's face flushed with a mix of anger and disbelief. She had worked tirelessly to get where she was, not just in her career but in every aspect of her life. The insinuation that she hadn't earned her success, that it had all been given to her, struck a chord with her. She could feel the tension in the air growing thicker by the second. The surrounding diners had started to notice, their heads turning slightly as they caught fragments of the conversation. Sandra's frustration was evident, and she knew she had to say something before the situation became any worse. She locked eyes with the waiter, her voice now firm. "I'm not here to have this conversation," she said, her words sharp but controlled. "I came here to have a peaceful meal, not to be insulted." The waiter, clearly not expecting the confrontation, looked taken aback for a moment. He opened, his mouth probably to apologize, but Sandra raised her hand, signaling for him to stop. "You've crossed a line," she said, her tone resolute. "I don't care how busy you are or how tough your day has been. There's no excuse for being rude." The waiter, now realizing the gravity of the situation, muttered a quick apology before retreating, his face flushed with embarrassment. Sandra took a deep breath, trying to calm herself down. The whole ordeal had left a bad taste in her mouth, but she knew she couldn't let one person ruin her night. She had worked too hard to get to this point in her life. The rest of the evening passed without incident, and, while Sandra didn't let the waiter's words ruin her meal, the experience served as a reminder. No matter how famous, how accomplished, or how composed you are, there are always people who think they can disrespect you, and sometimes standing up for yourself is the only way to reclaim your peace. What started as a minor annoyance quickly turned into something far more uncomfortable. Sandra had tried to brush off the waiter's initial offhand remarks, chalking it up to a misunderstanding. But the more he spoke, the more his behavior became impossible to ignore. He had started with subtle condescension, but as the conversation wore on, it was clear that he wasn't going to stop. It felt as though he was deliberately pushing her buttons. His smirk grew more noticeable, and his words became laced with a mocking tone that was hard to miss. At one point, he casually made a snide remark about Sandra's movie choices. "You know," he said, his tone almost sarcastic, "some of your movies, well, let's just say they didn't have the same class as some of your peers. I always wondered how that works in Hollywood." Sandra's face immediately flushed with frustration, a deep pang of irritation tightening in her chest. She had dealt with far worse in her career: endless media scrutiny, harsh critiques, and the constant judgment that came with fame. But this felt different. This wasn't a critique of her work or her abilities as an actress. This was personal. He was questioning her worth, her character, in a way that made her feel like she was being diminished. She took a slow breath, trying to maintain her composure, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. Sandra had spent years learning how to handle negative comments, how to smile through the tough ones and keep pushing forward. But this was more than just a negative comment. It was an insult to her, as a person. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air between them, and Sandra could feel the heat of the moment building. Before she could even formulate a response, her voice barely above a whisper, the waiter interrupted her. His next words were even more biting, delivered with a smirk that made her stomach churn. "Maybe you should stick to what you're good at," he said, his words dripping with sarcasm. "You know, acting for the cameras. This fancy restaurant is a bit out of your league." The insult was sharp and cutting, and it stung more than anything he had said before. Sandra's chest tightened as the realization set in. This man who knew nothing about her career, or her life, had just belittled her in front of a room full of strangers. She glanced around the restaurant, noticing the eyes of the other diners subtly shifting toward her table. Some pretended to ignore the tension, but others clearly seemed to notice. The discomfort in the air was palpable. Sandra's hands trembled slightly as she set down her wine glass. She wasn't sure what to do. She had never been one to tolerate public confrontation, and she certainly wasn't about to cause a scene. But this was different. This wasn't a passing moment. And the waiter wasn't backing down. He was purposefully provoking her, pushing her to react. She was caught off guard and visibly hurt, unsure of how to navigate this moment without escalating things further. The last thing she wanted was to be the subject of some drama, to have a scene break out in the middle of the dining room, especially over something so petty. But as the waiter continued to stand there, waiting for a reaction, She realized she couldn't just let this go. Just as Sandra was about to open her mouth to speak, her voice low and controlled, prepared to call out the waiter on his disrespect, she noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The soft jazz music in the background seemed to fade into the distance as a new figure entered the restaurant. It wasn't a sudden entrance, but there was something about this person's presence that caught Sandra's attention immediately. A familiar face, one she hadn't seen in a while, but one she instantly recognized. It was Keanu Reeves. His tall frame and steady, calm demeanor stood out immediately as he walked through the door, his head held high, exuding a quiet confidence. As always, Keanu's presence had a way of lighting up the room, not through flashy gestures, but with an unspoken sense of calm and integrity. Sandra's heart relaxed at the sight of him. In a moment that had felt charged with tension, his arrival was like a breath of fresh air. He walked through the restaurant with a natural ease, his movements purposeful but not rushed. Sandra's sense of unease melted slightly as she watched him approach the bar area. And then, as if it was fate, Keanu's eyes locked onto hers from across the room. Without missing a beat, he began to move toward her table, his calm gaze never leaving her. It wasn't just a coincidence. Keanu had an uncanny ability to read people and situations. Sandra knew he had seen her discomfort. Their eyes met, and in that moment Sandra felt a wave of relief wash over her. She didn't need to ask for help. Keanu had already sensed the tension. He was here, and she knew exactly what he was about to do. As he approached, the waiter, who had been lingering at the edge of the table, noticed Keanu's approach and immediately straightened up, his arrogance faltering. Keanu didn't acknowledge the waiter. His eyes were locked on Sandra. He reached the table and gave her a reassuring smile, his gentle presence instantly calming her nerves. "Everything all right here?" Keanu asked, his voice soft yet firm, with just enough authority to signal that this wasn't just a casual question. The waiter shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that this wasn't a confrontation he wanted. The man opened his mouth to speak, but stopped short when he saw the look in Keanu's eyes. A quiet, no-nonsense kind of stare that made it clear this wasn't going to be a situation he could talk his way out of. Sandra, grateful but still shaken, gave Keanu a small nod. The sense of relief she felt at his presence was overwhelming. He had stepped in, as he always did, without fanfare, but with perfect timing. Keanu turned his attention back to the waiter, his voice remaining calm but carrying the weight of authority. "I think you've made your point," he said, his words laced with quiet but undeniable strength. "But if you're finished here, I'd suggest you find a better way to treat your customers." The waiter, now visibly uncomfortable, nodded, quickly, mumbling an apology before retreating. Keanu's quiet strength had disarmed him, and he knew better than to push it any further. The moment was over, and with it, the tension that had been threatening to ruin Sandra's evening began to dissipate. Sandra, still processing what had just happened, looked up at Keanu, who was now seated across from her. The calm presence he brought with him felt like an anchor in the storm of emotions she had just experienced. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. Keanu smiled, ever the humble presence. "No need to thank me," he replied, his voice warm yet effortlessly modest. "Just doing what anyone would do." But Sandra knew better. Keanu wasn't just anyone. He had once again proven that kindness, when mixed with strength and integrity, could change the course of a situation. As the evening continued, Sandra found herself once again able to relax and enjoy her meal, thankful for a simple but powerful reminder of how much a moment of calm intervention could change everything. Keanu, sensing the discomfort in the air, walked directly over to Sandra's table. The moment he entered the scene, the atmosphere shifted. The soft jazz music in the background seemed to fade into the distance, and for a brief moment, everything around them fell silent. The waiter, caught off guard by Keanu's sudden presence, froze. He had been so wrapped up in his own arrogance and condescension that he hadn't even noticed the quiet shift in the room. As Keanu approached, the young man instinctively stood a little straighter, but his eyes darted nervously between Sandra and the new figure who had just entered. He hadn't expected someone like Keanu Reeves to intervene. Keanu, ever the calm and composed figure, didn't let the tension escalate further. His voice when it came was steady and firm, yet not confrontational. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his tone unwavering, but without the need to raise his voice. It was the kind of question that could cut through any pretense, a simple inquiry that conveyed his awareness of the tension in the air without sounding accusatory. The waiter, now suddenly aware of the gravity of the situation, stammered for a moment, caught off guard by the presence of someone so well known, yet so clearly unthreatening. His usual cocky demeanor faltered, and he hesitated before trying to brush it off, his words faltering. "Oh, I didn't mean to cause any trouble," he muttered, clearly not knowing how to handle the interaction. "Just a misunderstanding, that's all." Sandra, still trying to gather her thoughts after the rude exchange, couldn't help but feel a wave of relief wash over her as Keanu's calm presence filled the space. She had been struggling with how to address the situation herself, unsure if speaking up would only escalate things. But now, seeing Keanu step in so naturally, she was reminded of the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. She hadn't expected anyone to come to her aid in such a public manner, especially not in a restaurant where she had hoped for a peaceful evening. The situation had felt like a small but insidious assault on her dignity, and while she had handled it with restraint, Keanu's intervention gave her a sense of validation. Keanu wasn't about to let the waiter off with a simple apology or a brushed-off explanation. He had seen too many injustices in his own life, and this was no exception. His eyes met the waiter's with an undeniable authority, one that was grounded in quiet strength, not in anger or accusation, but in the recognition that some behaviors needed to be called out, especially in places where people should feel respected. "There's no place for that kind of behavior here," Keanu said, his voice steady, without a trace of aggression, but carrying a weight that was impossible to ignore. "You're in the service industry, and respect is the bare minimum we should expect from anyone in your position." His words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. The sheer calmness with which he spoke only made them all the more powerful. It wasn't just about defending Sandra. It was about upholding a standard of dignity and respect that anyone, regardless of their career or status, should be entitled to. Keanu's gaze never wavered from the waiter, his unwavering presence acting as a gentle but firm reminder that no one was above basic human decency. The waiter, now visibly shaken, took a step back, the weight of Keanu's words sinking in. He had expected to get away with treating a celebrity in a dismissive manner, perhaps thinking that Sandra would simply take it in stride as she had done so many times before. But Keanu was making it clear that this wasn't a situation that would be ignored no matter who was involved. The waiter muttered an apology under his breath, but the damage had been done. He seemed to realize that there was no easy way out of this, no way to simply brush off his earlier behavior. It was clear in his body language, the way his shoulders hunched and his eyes flicked downward, that he understood the gravity of the situation. But Keanu didn't push any further. There was no need for theatrics. Instead, he gave the waiter a chance to redeem himself, not by further confrontation, but by walking away from the situation and reflecting on his actions. "Walk away," Keanu said, his tone gentle but resolute. "Think about your actions before you interact with others. Respect isn't a privilege, it's a responsibility." The waiter nodded quickly, his face flushed with embarrassment. He looked like he wanted to say something more, perhaps offer another apology, but Keanu's calm demeanor made it clear that there was nothing more to say. With a final glance toward Sandra, the waiter turned and walked away, his departure marked by a mixture of humiliation and realization. As he retreated to the back of the restaurant, the tension in the air began to dissipate. The weight of the moment had lifted, and Sandra could finally take a deep breath, feeling like she could once again enjoy the peace she had come here for. Keanu turned back to Sandra, offering her a soft, reassuring smile, the warmth of his kindness evident in his eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with quiet concern. Sandra nodded, still processing the whirlwind of emotions she had just experienced. "I am now," she replied, the gratitude in her words clear. Keanu smiled and took a seat across from her, never making her feel as though the situation had to be explained or justified. He simply sat there with her, a quiet presence that spoke volumes. In the moments that followed, Sandra realized that Keanu's intervention hadn't just saved her evening. It had reminded her that no matter how many challenges one faces, standing up for respect and kindness can always make a difference. As they continued their meal, the weight of the earlier discomfort seemed to disappear, replaced by a quiet sense of gratitude. Keanu's simple act of speaking up had diffused a potentially volatile situation with grace, offering Sandra not just peace for the evening, but a reminder of the power of integrity and standing up for what's right, no matter how small the act may seem. For Sandra, this wasn't just a night at a restaurant. It was a reminder that no one should ever be made to feel less than, and that kindness and calm strength can transform a tense moment into something far more meaningful. It was a night she would always remember, not for the discomfort she felt, but for the kindness that came when it mattered most. As the waiter retreated, Sandra let out a quiet sigh of relief. The tension that had been building between her and the waiter seemed to dissolve into the air, leaving a sense of calm that Sandra hadn't felt for the last few minutes. Her shoulders, which had been tensed with frustration, relaxed. The uncomfortable weight of humiliation that had threatened to make this evening unforgettable for all the wrong reasons began to lift. Keanu, standing by her side like a silent pillar of support, offered her a reassuring smile that seemed to ground her in the present moment. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice calm and filled with genuine concern. The way Keanu spoke, there was no hint of judgment, no rush to move past the incident. It was as if he understood the emotional toll that even the smallest of insults could take, especially when they were so pointed and personal. He didn't need to know the specifics of what had happened. His mere presence offered a comfort that Sandra hadn't realized she was missing until now. His demeanor had a way of instantly disarming any remaining tension, offering the kind of quiet strength that calmed even the most unsettled spirits. Sandra, still a little rattled but grateful, nodded. "I am now," she replied, her voice filled with gratitude. Her eyes locked with his, and for a moment she allowed herself to take in the kindness that radiated from him. This simple exchange, Keanu stepping in, standing up for her without hesitation or demand, was a reminder that in a world that sometimes felt harsh, there were still people who would stand up for what was right. People who would speak up, in moments when others might have hesitated or looked the other way. The rest of the evening went smoothly. The soft hum of conversation resumed, and the soft jazz that had been playing in the background seemed to fill the room once more. The other diners, who had likely been aware of the tension but unsure of how to intervene, now returned to their meals, though Sandra couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of relief that the atmosphere had shifted so dramatically, thanks to Keanu. The initial discomfort faded as Keanu's presence continued to calm her, his steady and unwavering support creating an invisible shield around their table. The waiter's behavior, though brief, had left an imprint on Sandra's evening. At first it seemed like just a minor nuisance, a small blemish on what was supposed to be a peaceful, solitary dinner. But as the situation progressed, it became clear that this wasn't about just a rude comment or an offhand remark. It was about the respect we owe each other as human beings, the dignity that should be afforded to everyone, no matter their status, profession, or public persona. It was a reminder that sometimes the smallest interactions can be the most telling, and that everyone, regardless of who they are, deserves to be treated with kindness and respect. Sandra felt more at ease, knowing that there were people like Keanu in the world. In a society that sometimes feels quick to dismiss the value of others, it was a reminder that some people, though rare, are willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. Even when it involves calling out bad behavior, stepping into a situation that isn't their responsibility. In that brief moment, Keanu had done more than just defend her against a rude waiter. He had quietly but powerfully demonstrated what it meant to have integrity. He had shown that kindness doesn't have to be loud or demanding. It can be a quiet strength, a steady presence that cuts through discomfort and gives others the courage to stand up for themselves. Sandra's heart felt a little lighter as the evening went on. She could enjoy the rest of her meal without the weight of that previous moment hanging over her. She had come to the restaurant for a peaceful evening, and though the situation had threatened that peace, Keanu's intervention had given her back control. It wasn't just about finishing her meal. It was about regaining her sense of dignity and recognizing that kindness and integrity still matter, even in small, seemingly insignificant moments. The encounter with the waiter had left a lasting impact, not just because it was rude, but because it was a reflection of how easily people can be disregarded. Sandra had long been used to criticism, to being analyzed in the public eye, but this incident was different. It wasn't the public's judgment. It wasn't about the press or the fans or the movies she'd starred in. It was an individual, someone who she had no control over, diminishing her humanity for no reason at all. And it was a reminder that, while we can't control what others think or say, we can control how we respond, and sometimes that response requires the help of others. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a rude waiter and a famous actress. It was a reminder that kindness and integrity still matter in this often cynical world. When people are confronted with adversity or even the smallest of insults, the right person can step in, not just to resolve the situation, but to remind us all that standing up for what's right is always worth it. Keanu's simple yet powerful act of intervention didn't just save Sandra's night. It taught her that in moments of discomfort and adversity, there are still people who will choose kindness and empathy over indifference. Keanu's actions weren't just a one-time favor. They were a lesson in respect, empathy, and the importance of doing what's right, even when no one is watching. That night, Sandra learned that even in a moment of discomfort, the right person, at the right time, can make all the difference. And sometimes, the most powerful act of kindness is just showing up when you're needed most.